Isaiah Bennett stood at the edge of Blackwood Forest, watching torches flicker in the distance like angry fireflies converging on his position. 7 men on horseback hunting him through the darkness with bloodhounds baying at their heels. He could have run deeper into the woods, disappeared into caves he had known since childhood, but instead he waited. What those night riders did not know was that Isaiah had spent 3 years mapping every hollow, every false trail, every place where the earth fell away into nothing. They thought they were the hunters, but by dawn they would learn what it meant to chase a man who had turned an entire forest into his weapon. The horses would return without their riders, and the men who survived would speak of him in whispers for the rest of their lives, claiming he was something more than human. Something that moved like smoke and shadow between the ancient trees. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Isaiah Bennett began not with his escape, but 3 years earlier in 1838, when he was brought to the Rutherford plantation outside Knoxville, Tennessee. He had been sold away from his mother in Virginia, purchased at auction for $900 by Marcus Rutherford, a man whose wealth came from tobacco fields that stretched across 300 acres of rich Tennessee soil. Isaiah was 15 years old then, tall for his age, with hands that Rutherford believed would be perfect for the hardest labor. What Rutherford did not see, could never have seen, was the mind behind Isaiah's careful silence. A mind that observed everything, forgot nothing, and planned constantly. The Rutherford plantation sat at the base of the Cumberland Mountains, bordered on 3 sides by what the locals called Blackwood Forest, a dense wilderness of oak and hickory and pine that stretched for miles into the high country. Most of the enslaved people on the plantation feared those woods, filled as they were with stories of people who had run into the trees and never returned, either caught by slave catchers or lost forever in the tangled undergrowth. But Isaiah did not fear the forest. From his first week on the plantation, he began to learn it. His work assignment gave him the opportunity he needed. Marcus Rutherford fancied himself a hunter, and he needed someone to maintain the hunting trails that wound through the edges of Blackwood Forest. Isaiah volunteered for the task, knowing it would take him away from the overseer's constant watch, knowing it would give him time alone in the woods. 3 times a week he would take an axe and a brush cutter and disappear into the forest, ostensibly to clear fallen branches and mark trails. Instead, he was creating a map in his mind, a 3-dimensional understanding of every ridge and valley, every stream and rock formation. He learned where the limestone caves opened into the hillsides, hidden behind curtains of mountain laurel. He discovered the places where underground springs bubbled up, providing fresh water far from any marked trail. He found the deadfalls, places where the earth had collapsed into sinkholes that could swallow a man and horse if they stepped wrong in the darkness. Most importantly, he learned to read the forest itself, to understand how sound traveled differently in different conditions, how mist pooled in the hollows at dawn, how the wind shifted with the turning of the day. Isaiah was not the first person enslaved on the Rutherford plantation to think of escape. In his 2nd year there, a man named Joseph had run, making it 3 days into the forest before the dogs found him. Isaiah had been forced to watch as they brought Joseph back, had been forced to witness the punishment that followed. He learned from Joseph's mistake. Joseph had run in panic with no plan beyond getting away. Isaiah would not make that error. When he ran, it would be because he had turned the forest into an ally, because he had prepared so thoroughly that his escape would be not an act of desperation, but a calculated strategy. The other enslaved people on the plantation began to notice Isaiah's long absences in the woods. An older woman named Martha, who worked in the big house and heard things the field workers never learned, pulled him aside one evening in the fall of 1840. She told him that Rutherford had been meeting with other plantation owners, that they were concerned about the increasing number of escapes along the Underground Railroad routes that ran through Tennessee. They were organizing night rider patrols, groups of armed men who would hunt down anyone who tried to flee. Martha's eyes held a warning when she told him this, but also a question. She wanted to know if he was planning something, if all those hours in the forest meant what she thought they meant. Isaiah did not answer her directly, but he squeezed her hand in a way that told her everything. After that conversation, Martha began to help him in small ways. She would leave extra cornbread wrapped in cloth near the woodpile, food that would not spoil quickly. She slipped him a flint and steel from Rutherford's hunting supplies. Most valuable of all, she told him about the night riders, about how they operated. They traveled in groups of 6 to 8 men, she said. They used dogs to track scent. They knew the main trails through the forest, but rarely ventured off them, especially at night. They were farmers and merchants, not woodsmen, men who carried rifles but whose real weapon was intimidation and superior numbers. Through the winter of 1840 and into the spring of 1841, Isaiah continued his work in the forest. He began to create false trails, paths that looked well used but led to dangerous terrain. He identified narrow passages between rocks where a man on foot could squeeze through but a horse could not follow. He located thick stands of mountain laurel and rhododendron, vegetation so dense that it created natural barriers. In his mind, he was constructing an elaborate trap, one that would not snap shut on his pursuers but would lead them deeper and deeper into terrain that favored him and weakened every advantage they possessed. By summer, his plan was ready. He had prepared 3 caches of supplies hidden in different caves, each stocked with dried food, water containers, and materials for making fire. He had identified the route he would take if pursued, a winding path through the most difficult terrain in Blackwood Forest that would take his hunters far from any help. He had even planned for the dogs, remembering an old trick his grandfather had told him about years before, involving certain plants that could confuse a hound's sense of smell when crushed and spread along a trail. The opportunity came in late July. Rutherford was planning a trip to Nashville that would take him away from the plantation for 5 days. The overseer, a cruel man named Dawson who relied on Rutherford's authority to maintain control, would be in charge. But Dawson was lazy and spent his evenings drinking corn whiskey in the overseer's cabin. Isaiah chose the second night of Rutherford's absence when Dawson would be at his most complacent, least expecting trouble. He left at midnight, slipping out of the slave quarters with nothing but the clothes on his back and a small bundle containing the supplies Martha had helped him accumulate. He did not head immediately for the forest. Instead, he walked deliberately to the main road, leaving clear footprints in the soft dirt, making sure that when they discovered his absence in the morning, they would find an obvious trail heading north toward Kentucky. He followed the road for 2 miles, then cut into a creek and walked upstream for another mile, letting the water wash away his scent. Only then did he enter Blackwood Forest, at a point he had chosen specifically for how it connected to the deeper wilderness. They discovered he was gone at dawn. Isaiah, already 5 miles into the forest, heard the alarm bell ringing across the valley, the sound that meant an escape. He did not hurry. He maintained a steady pace, moving to the first of his supply caches, a cave hidden behind a waterfall that trickled down a moss-covered rock face. There he ate, drank, and waited. He knew what would happen next. Dawson would send riders to the neighboring plantations to raise the alarm. They would gather a hunting party. They would bring dogs, and they would follow the false trail he had left on the road before cutting into the creek. It took them longer than he expected. The sun was past its peak when he finally heard the distant baying of hounds. They had wasted hours following his road trail north before someone, probably a more experienced tracker, had figured out the deception and backtracked to where he entered the creek. Now they were trying to pick up his scent along the stream bed. Isaiah smiled to himself in the darkness of the cave. Let them search. Every hour they spent looking was an hour he could rest, could prepare for what came next. By late afternoon, the sounds of the hunt had faded. They had not found where he left the creek. Isaiah used the remaining daylight hours to move to his second cache, this one located in a hollow tree 3 miles deeper into the forest. As he walked, he began to prepare the trail behind him. He crushed wild onion plants and spread them across his path, knowing the strong scent would confuse the dogs. He walked across bare rock wherever possible, leaving no tracks. In soft ground, he used a branch to sweep away his footprints, then deliberately created false prints heading in the wrong direction. That night, he slept in the hollow tree upstem, his body wedged into the space that had once housed a bear. He woke before dawn to the sound of voices. They had camped less than a mile away, he realized. He could hear them arguing about which direction to search. One voice he recognized as Dawson. Another belonged to Clayton Briggs, a neighboring plantation owner who was known for his enthusiasm in hunting down escaped slaves. There were others he did not recognize, probably men from town who had joined for the excitement or the potential reward. Isaiah listened carefully to their conversation. They were frustrated, uncertain. The dogs had lost his scent completely. Dawson wanted to turn back, to get more experienced trackers. But Briggs was insistent that Isaiah could not have gone far, that he must be hiding nearby. Isaiah heard Briggs say something that made his blood run cold. They had brought tracking dogs, yes, but they had also brought bloodhounds of a different kind. Animals trained not just to follow scent, but to attack when they found their quarry. This changed his calculations. Isaiah had planned to keep moving deeper into the forest to stay ahead of his pursuers until they gave up. But attack dogs meant he could not afford to be caught in the open. He needed to turn the hunt around, to become the hunter himself. As the sun rose and the voices of the men grew louder with their preparations for another day of searching, Isaiah made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would not run from them anymore. He would lead them exactly where he wanted them to go. He left the hollow tree and moved with careful speed to a place he had discovered months earlier, a section of the forest where the terrain became treacherous. The ground there was covered with a thick layer of leaves and pine needles, beautiful and soft-looking. But underneath, hidden from view, were dozens of sinkholes and limestone fissures. A man who knew where to step could cross safely. A man who did not, especially a man moving quickly or riding a horse, would find the earth giving way beneath him. Isaiah crossed this dangerous ground using a path he had memorized, stepping from rock to root to safe ground with the confidence of someone who had walked it 100 times before. On the far side, he deliberately broke branches and disturbed bushes, creating obvious signs of passage. Then he retreated to high ground, a rocky outcrop that gave him a view of the sinkhole field, and he waited. The hunters found his trail around mid-morning. Isaiah watched from his hiding place as 7 men on horseback emerged from the tree line, following the signs he had left. Dawson was there, and Briggs and 5 others Isaiah did not know. The dogs strained at their leashes, pulling toward the disturbed bushes on the far side of the sinkhole field. Isaiah saw Briggs point to the broken branches, saw him spur his horse forward with confidence. What happened next occurred in seconds but felt like hours. Briggs' horse stepped onto the leaf-covered ground, and immediately the earth collapsed beneath it. The horse screamed, a sound Isaiah had never heard before and would never forget, as it fell into a sinkhole that opened like a mouth. Briggs was thrown clear, landing hard on ground that mercifully was solid. But 2 other riders, following close behind, were not so fortunate. Their horses also broke through the false ground, and the men shouted in panic as they tumbled into hidden fissures. The remaining riders pulled their horses back in terror. The dogs were going wild, barking and howling at the screaming horses and cursing men. Isaiah watched as Dawson and the others dismounted, approaching the sinkholes carefully, trying to help their companions. One of the fallen men was crying out that his leg was broken. Another was silent, either unconscious or dead. The horses that had fallen were beyond help. Isaiah could see that even from a distance. It took them an hour to extract the fallen men from the sinkholes. Isaiah used that time to move to his next position. He had no desire to see men die despite what they would have done to him if they had caught him. But he needed them to understand that they were not hunting an ignorant runaway. They were in his territory now, and every step they took deeper into Blackwood Forest was a step into a trap he had spent 3 years preparing. When they finally regrouped, Isaiah could see the change in them even from a distance. They were frightened now. They had lost 3 horses and had 2 injured men. Dawson was arguing loudly that they should turn back, get help, return with more men and better equipment. But Briggs, limping from his fall but apparently unhurt otherwise, was adamant. He pointed in the direction Isaiah had gone, shouting that they could not let a slave make fools of them, that if word got out they had been beaten by one man, every plantation in the county would face uprisings. The appeal to fear and pride worked. The remaining 5 men, now all on foot, decided to continue the hunt. They left the 2 injured men with instructions to make their way back to the forest edge. Then they pressed forward, following Isaiah's trail. The dogs, traumatized by the screaming horses, were less enthusiastic now, but they still followed the scent. Isaiah led them on through the afternoon, always staying just ahead, always leaving enough sign to keep them coming. He took them across streams swollen with summer rain, forcing them to wade through waist-deep water. He led them through dense thickets of thorns that tore at their clothes and skin. He brought them to steep ravines where they had to climb down one side and struggle up the other, exhausting them with every step. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and purple through the forest canopy, Isaiah reached the place he had been heading toward all along. It was a box canyon, a dead end where the forest pressed against a cliff face that rose 50 feet into the air. There was no way out except the way in. To anyone pursuing him, it would look like he had made a fatal mistake, trapping himself in a place with no escape, but Isaiah knew something his pursuers could not. Behind the waterfall that cascaded down the cliff face, hidden by the falling water and the mist it created, there was a narrow ledge that led to a cave. The cave opened into a passage that wound through the mountain, eventually emerging a mile away on the other side. He had explored this route thoroughly, knew every twist and turn, every place where he had to squeeze sideways through narrow rock. Every pool of water he would have to wade through in absolute darkness. He entered the canyon as the last light was fading from the sky. The hunters were close behind now. He could hear them crashing through the underbrush, shouting to each other to hurry, believing they finally had him cornered. Isaiah splashed through the pool at the base of the waterfall and slipped behind the falling water. The ledge was slick with moss, barely wide enough for his feet, but he had practiced this crossing before, and his hands knew where to grip the rock. In seconds, he was inside the cave, invisible to anyone below. The hunters burst into the canyon just as full darkness fell. Isaiah, hidden in the cave entrance, watched them by the light of the torches they had lit. He counted 5 men, all of them exhausted, clothes torn, faces scratched from thorns. Briggs was in the lead, and even in the flickering torchlight, Isaiah could see the triumph on his face. They thought they had won. Briggs shouted into the darkness, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. He called Isaiah by name, told him there was no escape, promised that if he surrendered now, the punishment would not be as severe. The lies were almost funny. Isaiah knew exactly what waited for him if he was caught. He had seen what they did to Joseph. Surrender meant torture and probably death. But from his hiding place he said nothing, did nothing. He simply waited. The men argued about what to do next. It was full dark now, and the canyon was a pool of shadows beyond the reach of their torchlight. Dawson wanted to camp and wait for morning, to search the canyon in daylight, but Briggs was impatient. He insisted that Isaiah must be hiding somewhere close, probably in one of the rock crevices at the base of the cliff. He ordered the men to spread out and search. What happened over the next hour was almost too easy. The hunters, exhausted and working in poor light, began to make mistakes. One man walked too close to a drop-off hidden in shadow and fell 10 feet, screaming as he landed on rocks below. Another, searching a pile of boulders, disturbed a nest of copperhead snakes and was bitten before he could retreat. The dogs, sensing the fear and confusion of the men, began to howl and strain at their leashes, adding to the chaos. By midnight, the hunters had given up. They built a fire in the center of the canyon and huddled around it, 3 men nursing injuries, all of them jumping at every sound from the darkness. Isaiah watched them from the cave, seeing how they kept their backs to the fire, how they held their rifles ready, how they flinched when the wind moved through the trees. These were not woodsmen. They were farmers and townspeople playing at being hunters, and the forest at night terrified them. Isaiah could have left then, could have slipped through the cave passage and been miles away by dawn. But he found himself staying, watching these men who had come to drag him back to slavery, who would have killed him without hesitation if they had caught him. He stayed because he needed to see what the night would do to them, needed to understand if his plan had worked, not just to escape, but to break their will to hunt. As the night deepened, the men around the fire began to hear things. Isaiah knew it was just the normal sounds of the forest, the calls of owls and the rustle of nocturnal animals moving through the underbrush. But to the hunters, these sounds became something else. They began to whisper about seeing movement in the shadows, about hearing footsteps circling their camp. Briggs shouted into the darkness several times, demanding that Isaiah show himself, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Now it sounded scared. Around 3 in the morning, one of the men broke. He suddenly stood up, dropped his rifle, and announced he was leaving. That no amount of money was worth this, that the forest was cursed and Isaiah was a devil. The others tried to stop him, but he pushed past them and ran toward the canyon entrance. Isaiah heard him crashing through the darkness, heard him cry out as he stumbled and fell, then silence. The remaining men called after him but received no answer. They did not go after him. Dawn came slowly to the canyon, gray light gradually replacing the darkness. Isaiah, who had not slept, watched as the hunters assessed their situation in the morning light. Of the 7 men who had entered Blackwood Forest hunting him, 3 were injured badly enough that they could barely walk. 1 had run off in the night, and the remaining 3 looked like they had aged 10 years overnight. Their faces were haggard, their eyes haunted. The dogs lay exhausted at their feet, no longer interested in hunting anything. Briggs tried one more time to rally the men. He pointed to the cliff face, insisted that Isaiah must be up there somewhere, that they should search more carefully in the daylight. But his words fell on deaf ears. Dawson, who had a deep gash on his forehead from walking into a low branch in the dark, flatly refused. He said they had lost, that Isaiah had beaten them, that they should count themselves lucky to be alive and get out of the forest while they still could. The argument that followed was brief and bitter. In the end, pragmatism won. The men gathered their gear, helped the injured to their feet, and began the long walk back to the canyon entrance. Isaiah watched them go, seeing how they kept looking over their shoulders, how they moved in a tight group as if afraid to spread out. They were beaten men, and they knew it. When they were gone, Isaiah emerged from the cave. He stood in the quiet canyon, feeling the morning sun on his face, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Then he turned and entered the cave passage that led through the mountain. The journey through the darkness took him 2 hours, navigating by memory and touch, wading through cold underground pools, squeezing through narrow gaps in the rock. When he finally emerged on the far side of the mountain, he was in a part of the forest he had saved for last, his final sanctuary. The cave he had prepared here was larger and more comfortable than the others. He had stocked it with enough supplies to last 2 weeks. His plan had always been to stay hidden here until the search died down, then to begin the long journey north. But as he settled into the cave and ate his first real meal in 2 days, Isaiah realized something had changed. The men who had hunted him would not be back. More than that, they would tell others what had happened in Blackwood Forest, and the story would grow with each telling. Over the next week, Isaiah stayed in his cave sanctuary and watched the forest edge from hidden vantage points. He saw search parties enter the woods several times, but they never came deep, never ventured beyond the well-marked trails. He heard them calling to each other, heard the nervousness in their voices. On the 5th day, he saw Briggs himself standing at the forest edge with a group of men pointing into the trees but making no move to enter. Whatever Briggs was saying, the other men were shaking their heads, clearly refusing to follow him into the woods. By the 10th day, the searches had stopped completely. Isaiah began to venture further from his cave, exploring parts of the forest he had not yet mapped. He found a valley where wild apple trees grew, their fruit just ripening. He discovered a spring that flowed year-round, cold and clear. He began to think not about leaving, but about staying, about making Blackwood Forest his permanent home. But survival alone was not enough. Isaiah had not escaped slavery just to live like an animal in the woods. He needed purpose, needed to feel that his freedom meant something beyond mere existence. The answer came to him one evening as he sat at the mouth of his cave, watching the sun set over the valley below. Other people would run, other enslaved men and women would flee their bondage and need help. He could provide that help. He could use his knowledge of the forest to shelter them, to guide them, to teach them what he had learned. The first person he helped was a young woman named Rebecca who stumbled into his valley 3 weeks after his own escape. She was half-starved, terrified, running from a plantation near Chattanooga. Isaiah heard her crying in the woods and found her collapsed near the spring. He brought her to his cave, fed her, and listened to her story. She was running north, trying to reach family in Ohio. Isaiah spent 2 days teaching her the basics of forest survival, then guided her to the far edge of Blackwood Forest and pointed her toward the next station on the Underground Railroad. Over the months that followed, others came. Some found the forest by chance. Others were directed there by whispered rumors among the enslaved communities that there was a place of safety in the mountains, a ghost who helped runaways. Isaiah never revealed himself to anyone except those who needed help. He became a shadow, a story, a legend that grew with each person who passed through his sanctuary and lived to tell about it. The legend was helped by the men who had hunted him. The stories they told, trying to explain why 7 armed men had failed to catch 1 unarmed slave, became more elaborate with each telling. They spoke of Isaiah moving like smoke through the trees, of how he seemed to appear and disappear at will, of how the forest itself had fought against them. Some claimed he had supernatural powers, that he could talk to animals and control the weather. Others said he was not even human anymore, that he had become some kind of forest spirit. Marcus Rutherford, returning from Nashville to find his valuable property gone and his overseer humiliated, was furious. He offered a reward of $500 for Isaiah's capture, an enormous sum that attracted bounty hunters from 3 states. But none of them lasted more than a day in Blackwood Forest. Isaiah watched them come and go, sometimes helping them get lost, sometimes just letting the forest do the work for him. The men who ventured deep enough to be a real threat found themselves facing the same tricks that had defeated the original hunters. False trails, dangerous terrain, and the psychological weight of being watched by an enemy they could never see. By the spring of 1842, a full year after his escape, the bounty hunters had stopped coming. The reward remained posted, but no one was willing to try for it. Blackwood Forest had gained a reputation as a cursed place, and Isaiah Bennett had become something more than a man in the minds of those who spoke his name. He was a ghost story, a warning, a symbol of resistance that frightened slave owners throughout eastern Tennessee. Martha, the woman who had helped him prepare for his escape, heard the stories and smiled to herself as she went about her work in the Rutherford house. She never told anyone about the help she had given Isaiah, but when other enslaved people asked her if the stories were true, if Isaiah really was still out there in the forest, she would just nod and say that some men were not meant to be held in chains, that some spirits were too wild to cage. In the summer of 1842, Isaiah helped a family of 5 escape from a plantation in the valley. It was his most ambitious operation yet, guiding them through the forest to a connection with a Quaker family who operated a station on the Underground Railroad. As he said goodbye to them at the edge of the forest, the father, a man named Daniel, asked Isaiah why he did not come with them, why he chose to stay in the woods rather than continue north to real freedom. Isaiah thought about the question for a long time before answering. He told Daniel that this was his freedom, that these mountains and this forest were his home in a way that nowhere else could ever be. He had been born in Virginia, sold to Tennessee, owned by men who thought they could put a price on a human soul. But in Blackwood Forest, he belonged to himself alone. He was not running anymore. He was standing his ground, and in doing so, he was showing others that resistance was possible, that the power of slave owners was not absolute. As 1842 turned into 1843, the stories about Isaiah Bennett began to spread beyond Tennessee. Abolitionists in the North told his story as an example of intelligence and courage triumphing over brutality. Enslaved people across the South whispered his name as proof that escape was possible, that the masters were not invincible. And in the slave-owning communities of eastern Tennessee, parents began to use his story to frighten children, telling them not to go into the woods where the ghost of Isaiah Bennett still walked. But Isaiah was no ghost. He was very much alive, living in his forest sanctuary, helping runaways when they came and perfecting his knowledge of the wilderness that had become his fortress. He learned to hunt with snares and traps, never risking the sound of a rifle that might give away his position. He learned which plants were edible and which were medicinal. He learned to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals. He became, in every sense, a part of the forest itself. In the winter of 1843, a bounty hunter more determined and experienced than the others came to Blackwood Forest. His name was Garrett, and he had a reputation for always getting his man. He studied the terrain carefully, interviewed everyone who had ever tried to hunt Isaiah, and developed a plan that he believed would succeed where others had failed. He would not come in force with dogs and torches. Instead, he would come alone, quietly, using patience and skill rather than intimidation. Isaiah knew Garrett was in the forest within hours of his arrival. The man was good, better than anyone else who had come before, but he was still an outsider in Isaiah's domain. For 3 weeks, the two men played a game of cat and mouse through the winter woods. Garrett was methodical, checking and rechecking his ground, setting up observation posts, trying to anticipate where Isaiah might appear. But Isaiah had the advantage of 3 years of intimate knowledge, and he used it mercilessly. He led Garrett on a chase that covered 50 miles of the most brutal terrain in the Cumberland Mountains. He left false signs that suggested he was injured, drawing Garrett into dangerous ravines. He doubled back on his own trail, watching Garrett pass within feet of where he lay hidden. He stole supplies from Garrett's camp, subtle things the man would not notice immediately, creating a growing sense of paranoia. In the end, it was not Isaiah who defeated Garrett, but the forest itself. The bounty hunter, exhausted and frustrated, made a mistake, stepping on ice-covered rocks near a waterfall. He fell, breaking his ankle, and lay helpless in the cold for 2 days before Isaiah found him. The ethical thing, the human thing, would have been to leave him to die. But Isaiah could not do it. He dragged Garrett to shelter, built a fire to warm him, and left food and water within reach. Then he disappeared, leaving Garrett alive but defeated. When Garrett finally limped out of Blackwood Forest 6 days later, frost-bitten and humiliated, he told a story that added to the legend. He said that Isaiah Bennett could have killed him, should have killed him by every law of survival and revenge, but had chosen mercy instead. This act of compassion, more than any trick or trap, convinced Garrett and many others that Isaiah was not the devil the slave owners claimed, but a man of principle, a man who deserved his freedom. The years passed. Isaiah remained in Blackwood Forest, becoming more myth than man to those who spoke of him. The Underground Railroad operators in the region began to use his forest as a way station, leaving supplies in marked locations and directing runaways to follow certain trails that would bring them to safety. Isaiah never revealed himself to these conductors, but they knew he was there, protecting their charges, ensuring safe passage through the mountains. In 1845, the Mexican-American War drew attention and resources away from domestic slave catching. In 1846, the Wilmot Proviso sparked national debates about slavery's expansion. Through all of this, Isaiah lived his quiet existence in the mountains, disconnected from the larger political movements but contributing in his own way to the cause of freedom. Every person he helped escape, every slave catcher he turned back empty-handed, was a small victory in a much larger war. By 1848, 7 years after his escape, Isaiah had become a permanent fixture in the folklore of eastern Tennessee. The stories told about him had diverged wildly from reality. Some claimed he commanded an army of escaped slaves in the mountains. Others said he had built an entire village deep in Blackwood Forest. A few insisted he had died years ago and only his spirit remained, haunting the woods and protecting runaways from beyond the grave. The truth was simpler and perhaps more remarkable. Isaiah Bennett was a man who had chosen freedom over safety, principle over comfort, and solitude over community. He had learned every secret of his forest home, had turned it into a weapon against those who would enslave him, and had used that knowledge to help others find their own path to liberty. He had started as property, valued at $900, and had become priceless, a symbol of resistance that no amount of money could purchase or capture. The last confirmed sighting of Isaiah Bennett came in the fall of 1848. A conductor on the Underground Railroad, a Quaker named Robert Hayes, was guiding a group of 7 runaways through the Cumberland Mountains when they became lost in a sudden snowstorm. As they huddled together, facing the real possibility of freezing to death, a man emerged from the whiteout conditions. He was tall, with a thick beard and eyes that Hayes described as both kind and utterly wild. The man led them to a cave, showed them where supplies were hidden, and gave them directions to the next safe house. When Hayes asked his name, the man smiled and said only, "Tell them the forest takes care of its own." Then he disappeared back into the snow. Hayes believed it was Isaiah Bennett, though he could never be certain. He described the man to others who had claimed to see Isaiah over the years, and the descriptions matched closely enough to suggest it might have been him. But Hayes also noted something that troubled him. The man looked older than Isaiah should have been, worn down by years of harsh living. Hayes worried that the life Isaiah had chosen, for all its freedom, was taking a toll that might not be sustainable. After that sighting, the stories faded. No more credible reports of Isaiah Bennett emerged from Blackwood Forest. The Underground Railroad continued to operate in the region, and runaways continued to find their way through the mountains. But whether Isaiah was still helping them remained unknown. Some believed he had finally left Tennessee, traveling north to Canada or west to the frontier. Others thought he had died in the forest, his bones resting in some hidden cave known only to the mountains themselves. The truth, whatever it was, remained hidden in the depths of Blackwood Forest. But the impact of Isaiah Bennett's resistance continued long after the man himself had vanished. The story of the slave who outsmarted 7 armed hunters became a rallying point for abolitionists, proof that enslaved people were not the inferior beings that slavery's defenders claimed. The legend of the ghost in the woods kept slave catchers away from Blackwood Forest, inadvertently creating a safe corridor for the Underground Railroad that saved dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives. Marcus Rutherford never recovered from the humiliation of losing Isaiah. His authority over his remaining slaves was permanently damaged, and he began to have trouble retaining overseers who feared they would suffer Dawson's fate. In 1850, Rutherford sold the plantation and moved to Memphis, a broken man whose obsession with recapturing one escaped slave had destroyed his standing in the community. Clayton Briggs, the man who had led the hunt into the canyon, became a changed person after that night. He stopped participating in slave patrols and eventually freed the 7 people he held in bondage, an act that scandalized his neighbors. When asked why, he would only say that he had learned in Blackwood Forest that some people were meant to be free, and fighting against that truth would destroy anyone who tried. The other hunters who survived that night in the forest spoke of it rarely and never in detail. They had gone into Blackwood Forest believing they were superior beings hunting inferior property. They had come out knowing they had been utterly defeated by a man who had every reason to hate them but had chosen instead to simply prove them wrong. As the 1850s progressed and the nation moved inexorably towards civil war, the story of Isaiah Bennett became part of the larger narrative of resistance and rebellion. Frederick Douglass mentioned him in a speech in 1854, calling him an example of how intelligence and preparation could overcome even the most oppressive systems. Harriet Tubman, the great conductor of the Underground Railroad, reportedly told people that Isaiah Bennett's tactics had influenced her own methods of guiding slaves to freedom. But for all the talk and legend, the man himself remained absent from history's stage. He had appeared like a storm in 1841, had reshaped the landscape of possibility for a brief moment, and then had disappeared back into the wilderness that had given him sanctuary. Whether he lived to see the Civil War that would end slavery, whether he ever walked out of Blackwood Forest into a world where he was legally free, no one could say with certainty. What remained were the stories passed down through generations. Stories of a young man who refused to accept that any human being could own another. Stories of careful planning and intimate knowledge defeating superior force and numbers. Stories of mercy shown to enemies who deserved none. And most powerfully, stories of a forest that became a fortress, a sanctuary, a promise that freedom was always possible for those brave enough and smart enough to seize it. In the decades after the Civil War, historians tried to track down the truth about Isaiah Bennett. They interviewed elderly people who had lived in the region, searched plantation records and wanted posters, tried to separate fact from fiction in the accumulated legends. They found evidence that confirmed the basic outline. A slave named Isaiah Bennett had indeed escaped from the Rutherford plantation in 1841. A hunting party had indeed failed to recapture him despite multiple attempts, and runaways did indeed use Blackwood Forest as a relatively safe route through Tennessee for years afterward. But the man himself, what happened to him, where he finally ended up, remained a mystery. Some historians speculated he died in the forest, his body never recovered. Others believed he eventually made it to Canada and lived out his life there under a different name. A few claim to have found records suggesting he fought in the Civil War with a colored regiment, though the evidence was inconclusive. Perhaps the uncertainty was fitting. Isaiah Bennett had spent his life evading capture, moving like smoke through the trees, staying one step ahead of those who would define and confine him. That he should remain undefined and unconfined even in historical memory seemed appropriate, a final victory over all those who had tried to reduce him to property, to a price, to a simple story with a neat ending. What is certain is that on a summer night in 1841, 7 armed men rode into Blackwood Forest hunting a man they considered their inferior. By the next sunrise, only their horses had returned, and the men themselves staggered out days later, changed forever by the experience. They had learned that the young man they hunted was not only their equal, but, in the environment he had chosen and mastered, their superior in every way that mattered. The night riders came expecting an easy hunt. They found instead a teacher who gave them a lesson they would never forget. The forest had always been neutral territory, neither good nor evil, simply existing according to its own natural laws. But in Isaiah Bennett's hands it became a weapon, a shield, a statement of defiance that echoed through the years and inspired countless others to believe that freedom, no matter how distant or impossible it seemed, was always worth fighting for. And somewhere in the Cumberland Mountains, in the deep places where the old forest still stands untouched by roads and development, there might still be caves with hidden supplies, trails that lead to nowhere and everywhere, and the ghost of a young man who refused to be owned, who chose instead to belong only to himself and to the wild places that gave him sanctuary. The legend says he is still there, still moving like smoke between the trees, still helping those who need it, still free in a way that transcends any law or proclamation, free in the only way that truly matters, free in his soul and in the choices he made when the world tried to break him. Isaiah Bennett of Tennessee, slave who led the night riders into their own trap, who transformed a forest into a fortress and fear into freedom, who proved that one person with knowledge and courage could defeat any number of enemies with weapons and horses, who showed that true power comes not from chains and violence, but from understanding and preparation, who became a legend precisely because he refused to be captured by anyone's definition of what he should be. His story remains long after the man himself has passed into mystery, a reminder that freedom is not given but taken, not granted but seized, and that the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, can accomplish things that seem impossible until someone actually does them. But there was more to Isaiah's story than the legendary night in the canyon, more than the defeat of the night riders that made him a ghost story told across Tennessee. The years that followed his escape became a testament to something deeper than mere survival. They became a chronicle of how one man could build an entire world from nothing but knowledge, determination, and an unwavering belief in his own humanity. In the spring of 1849, 8 years after his escape, Isaiah had transformed his existence in Blackwood Forest from that of a fugitive to something closer to a guardian. His network of caves had expanded to include 7 different locations, each serving a specific purpose. One cave deep in the heart of the forest where 3 ridges met had become his primary residence. He had spent months improving it, building a stone fireplace whose smoke dispersed through natural fissures in the rock, creating sleeping platforms from split logs, even carving niches in the walls for storage. It was not luxurious by any measure, but it was his, and that made it more valuable than any plantation house could ever be. The isolation of his life was both a blessing and a burden. There were weeks when he spoke to no one, when his only companions were the deer that grazed in the meadows and the hawks that circled overhead. During these times, Isaiah would sometimes find himself talking aloud, narrating his actions to an invisible audience just to hear a human voice. He would tell stories to the trees, recounting memories of his mother in Virginia, of the songs she used to sing while working in the tobacco fields. These moments of loneliness cut deeper than any physical hardship the forest could offer. But the isolation also gave him a clarity of thought that he had never experienced while enslaved. In the plantation, every moment had been defined by someone else's will, someone else's schedule, someone else's priorities. Here in the forest, time belonged to him alone. He could spend an entire day watching how light moved through the canopy, learning the patterns that would help him navigate in different seasons. He could devote a week to perfecting a new trail that would save hours of travel. He could think, truly think, about questions that mattered to him, about freedom and dignity and what it meant to be fully human. One question that occupied his thoughts increasingly was what would happen to the knowledge he had accumulated. He had spent 8 years learning every secret of Blackwood Forest, but if he died tomorrow, all of that understanding would die with him. The thought troubled him deeply. This forest had saved his life and the lives of dozens of others who had passed through it. The trails he had marked, the caches he had hidden, the safe passages he had discovered, all of this represented a kind of library written in earth and stone rather than ink and paper. In the summer of 1849, Isaiah decided to do something about this. He began to create a physical map of Blackwood Forest, using materials he could find or make. He stretched deer hides across wooden frames, scraping them until they were smooth enough to mark on. For ink, he used a mixture of charcoal and plant oils. He carved a stylus from hardwood, sharpened to a fine point. Then slowly and painstakingly he began to transfer the map that existed in his mind onto these prepared surfaces. The work took months. Isaiah was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had never been allowed to learn reading or writing. But he had a natural gift for spatial reasoning and a memory that forgot nothing. His maps showed not just the layout of the forest, but layers of information that no conventional map would include. He marked the dangerous sinkholes with special symbols. He indicated which streams ran year-round and which dried up in summer. He showed where edible plants grew in different seasons, where cave entrances were hidden, where the best overlooks for spotting pursuers could be found. But he went further than simple geography. Isaiah began to write, teaching himself letters by copying them from a Bible he had taken from a bounty hunter's abandoned camp years earlier. His writing was crude at first, each letter formed with painstaking care, but he persisted. He added notes to his maps, warnings about specific dangers, instructions for using certain trails, even advice about the best times of year to travel through different areas. The act of writing, of taking thoughts from his mind and fixing them permanently on hide and paper, felt like a kind of magic, a way of speaking across time to people he would never meet. As he worked on his maps, Isaiah began to think more carefully about the people who might use them. The Underground Railroad conductors who operated in the region were brave and resourceful, but few of them had his intimate knowledge of this particular forest. If he could somehow get these maps to them, he could help far more people than he could ever guide personally. But doing so would require revealing his existence, trusting strangers with information that could be used against him if it fell into the wrong hands. The decision was made for him in the fall of 1849, when a young woman arrived in the forest in circumstances that changed everything. Her name was Delilah, and she was different from other runaways Isaiah had encountered. She was not fleeing alone, but was leading a group of 12 people, including 5 children under the age of 10. They had escaped from a plantation in northern Alabama and had been traveling for 3 weeks, following whispered directions that had led them to Blackwood Forest. Isaiah found them huddled in one of his secondary caves, exhausted and starving. The children were crying softly, too tired even to make much noise. Delilah herself was running a fever, her face flushed and her eyes too bright. She had pushed herself beyond the limits of endurance to get her people this far, and she was on the verge of collapse. For the first time since his escape, Isaiah came out of hiding completely, revealing himself to help people who desperately needed it. Over the next week, Isaiah worked tirelessly to restore the group to health. He brought food, hunted fresh meat, gathered medicinal herbs that Martha had taught him about years ago. He showed Delilah how to brew a tea from willow bark that would bring down her fever. He entertained the children with stories, showing them how to identify animal tracks and teaching them the calls of different birds. Slowly, under his care, the group regained their strength. Delilah, once she was well enough to talk at length, told Isaiah their story. She had been a house slave on a large plantation, trusted by the owners because of her apparent docility. But Delilah had been planning escape for 2 years, secretly learning the routes of the Underground Railroad, making contacts with conductors, preparing supplies. When the plantation owner decided to sell several families south to the cotton fields of Mississippi, Delilah knew it was time to act. She had organized the escape with military precision, getting 12 people off the plantation in the middle of the night without raising an alarm. But the journey had been harder than she anticipated. 2 of the contacts she had counted on had moved or been arrested. Food had run out faster than planned. The children had struggled with the pace. By the time they reached Blackwood Forest, they were days behind schedule and running out of options. Delilah had been preparing to leave the group in the forest and go for help alone when Isaiah found them. As Delilah recovered, she and Isaiah talked for hours. Isaiah found himself opening up in ways he never had before, telling her about his escape, about the night riders, about the 8 years he had spent building a life in the forest. Delilah listened with an intensity that made him feel truly heard for the first time in nearly a decade. She understood things about him that he had barely articulated to himself, understood the cost of his freedom and the loneliness it had required. Delilah also challenged him in ways he was not expecting. She asked him directly why he stayed in the forest when he could have made it to Canada years ago. She pushed him on whether he was truly free or just living in a different kind of cage, one made of trees instead of iron, but a cage nonetheless. She suggested that real freedom might require him to risk his hard-won safety to help others achieve what he had achieved. The conversations troubled Isaiah deeply because they touched on doubts he had been suppressing for years. He had convinced himself that staying in Blackwood Forest was about helping runaways, about maintaining a safe way station on the Underground Railroad. But if he was honest with himself, it was also about fear. He had created a world where he was in control, where he understood every variable, where he was safe. Leaving that world would mean returning to a place where he had no power, where he would always be looking over his shoulder, where his freedom would depend on the goodwill or indifference of white society. When Delilah's group was ready to travel, Isaiah made a decision that surprised even himself. He would guide them personally to the next station on the Underground Railroad, a journey that would take him further from Blackwood Forest than he had been in 8 years. He would bring his maps with him and entrust them to the conductors he met, ensuring that his knowledge would survive beyond his own lifetime. And he would see, once and for all, whether he had the courage to exist in the world beyond his forest sanctuary. The journey began on a cold October morning. Isaiah led the group through passages that only he knew, moving them quickly through terrain that would have taken days for them to navigate alone. The children, who had been frightened and exhausted when he found them, now looked at him with awe, calling him the Forest King and asking if he could talk to animals. Isaiah found their admiration both touching and uncomfortable, a reminder that he had become more legend than man even to those he was helping. They traveled for 3 days, moving mostly at night, hiding during the daylight hours in caves and hollow trees that Isaiah had long ago marked as safe. He taught them as they went, showing them how to walk without leaving obvious tracks, how to use streams to confuse pursuers, how to find north by the stars when clouds covered the sky. Delilah absorbed every lesson with fierce concentration, asking questions that showed she was thinking not just about this journey but about future escapes she might lead. On the 4th day, they reached the edge of Blackwood Forest and entered territory Isaiah had not seen in 8 years. The familiar comfort of his forest gave way to farmland and small roads, places where they could be spotted and reported. Isaiah felt exposed in a way that brought back all his memories of being enslaved, the constant awareness of being watched, of being property that could be seized at any moment. They reached the safe house just after midnight, a small farm operated by a Quaker family named Morrison. The father, Jacob Morrison, was a tall man with a long beard who greeted them with quiet efficiency, ushering them into a hidden cellar beneath his barn. When Isaiah revealed who he was, Morrison's eyes widened with recognition. The legend of Isaiah Bennett had reached even this far from Blackwood Forest. Morrison examined Isaiah's maps with growing excitement, immediately understanding their value. He told Isaiah that these maps could change how the Underground Railroad operated in eastern Tennessee, could save dozens of lives by showing conductors the safest routes through the mountains. He offered to have copies made and distributed to other conductors in the network. Isaiah agreed, with one condition: the maps should show the routes and resources but should not reveal the locations of his permanent camps. He was willing to share his knowledge but not to completely give up his sanctuary. While Morrison arranged for Delilah's group to continue their journey north, Isaiah prepared to return to Blackwood Forest. But before he left, Delilah pulled him aside for a private conversation. She told him that she had been watching him during their journey, had seen how he moved through the world beyond his forest, and she believed he was capable of more than he thought. She suggested that he consider moving north himself, using his skills to help the Underground Railroad in a more active way. Isaiah listened to her words but found himself resistant to the idea. He explained that Blackwood Forest was not a prison to him but a choice, a place where he could live on his own terms. He told her that not everyone's path to freedom looked the same, that some people needed to fight on the front lines while others served best by holding ground and providing sanctuary. Delilah accepted his answer but made him promise one thing: that he would not let his sanctuary become a hiding place, that he would continue to help others as he had helped her group. The journey back to Blackwood Forest took Isaiah 2 days of hard travel. When he finally crossed back into the familiar territory of his mountain home, he felt a complex mixture of relief and melancholy. The forest welcomed him back with the sounds and smells he knew better than his own heartbeat. But something had changed. His conversation with Delilah had planted seeds of doubt that would not stop growing. Over the following months, Isaiah found himself thinking more about the world beyond the forest. He began to venture out more frequently to the settlements at the forest's edge, always careful and disguised, but willing to take risks he would not have considered before. He established tentative contact with other members of the Underground Railroad network, people who knew him only by reputation but were eager to work with the legendary ghost of Blackwood Forest. These contacts brought him information about the larger abolitionist movement, about the growing tensions between slave states and free states, about people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman who were fighting slavery with words and actions. Isaiah began to feel a strange kinship with these activists, even though he had never met them. They were all, in their different ways, refusing to accept the world as it was and working to create something better. In the spring of 1850, Isaiah helped coordinate the escape of the largest group he had ever guided, 23 people from multiple plantations who had organized themselves into a single party. The operation required weeks of planning and the cooperation of several Underground Railroad conductors. Isaiah's role was to move the group through Blackwood Forest, the most dangerous leg of their journey where slave catchers were most likely to intercept them. The operation went flawlessly, a testament to Isaiah's 8 years of preparation and his new willingness to work with others. But it also drew attention. The simultaneous disappearance of 23 enslaved people from the Knoxville region caused outrage among plantation owners. Rewards were posted, militias were organized, and pressure was put on local law enforcement to crack down on Underground Railroad activity. For the first time in years, serious organized efforts were made to penetrate Blackwood Forest and find the person or people helping runaways escape. Isaiah found himself back in the role of hunted fugitive, but this time the stakes were different. He was not running from a single plantation owner's vengeance, but from a coordinated effort involving dozens of slave catchers and militiamen. The forest was no longer a place of absolute safety, but a contested territory where he had to be constantly vigilant. He began to wonder if his time in Blackwood Forest was coming to an end, if the very success of his operations had made his position untenable. The crisis came in the summer of 1850. A professional slave-catching company from Virginia, hearing the stories about Blackwood Forest and attracted by the accumulated rewards, sent a team of 12 men to systematically search the mountain wilderness. Unlike previous hunters, these men were patient and methodical. They did not rush in with dogs and torches, but set up a series of camps at different entry points to the forest and began a slow, coordinated sweep of the interior. Isaiah watched their operation with growing concern. These men were not amateurs. They were using tactics that could actually work, dividing the forest into sections and searching each one thoroughly before moving on. They were also cutting off his access to some of his supply caches and making it dangerous for him to move freely. For the first time since the night riders, Isaiah felt genuinely threatened. He had 3 options as he saw it. He could fight, using his knowledge of the terrain to pick off the hunters one by one, but that would mean becoming a killer, crossing a line he had always refused to cross. He could flee, abandoning Blackwood Forest and heading north to Canada, but that would mean giving up everything he had built and leaving future runaways without his protection. Or he could try something more subtle, something that would end the threat without violence or retreat. Isaiah chose the third option. Over the next 2 weeks, he waged a campaign of psychological warfare against the slave catchers that made his treatment of the night riders look gentle by comparison. He used every trick he had learned in 9 years of living in the forest and invented several new ones specifically for these professional hunters. He started by making them feel watched constantly. He would leave signs of his presence just outside their camps, footprints in obvious places, broken branches arranged in patterns. Small items from their supplies moved or rearranged. He made sure they never saw him directly, but always knew he was there. The psychological pressure was immense, and it began to show in how the hunters operated. They became paranoid, jumping at shadows, arguing with each other about whether they were really being watched or just imagining it. Then he began to separate them from their supplies. He would wait until hunters were away from their camps, then slip in and take specific items, never everything, just enough to cause confusion and concern. A rifle would disappear here, a bag of ammunition there. Someone's boots would vanish overnight. The hunters began to suspect each other of theft, and trust within the group started to break down. The final phase of Isaiah's campaign was the most audacious. He began to lead individual hunters away from the group using a combination of fake trails and carefully placed lures. A hunter would spot what looked like a fresh campsite and investigate. following signs that seemed to promise the discovery of Isaiah's main hideout. But the trail would lead them in circles, deeper into the forest until they were hopelessly lost. Isaiah would then guide them, without ever revealing himself, back toward the forest edge, making sure they emerged miles from where they had entered. One by one, the hunters began to quit. Some simply walked away, declaring that no amount of money was worth the mental strain of being in Blackwood Forest. Others suffered accidents, falls, and injuries that seemed suspiciously timed, that happened when they were most isolated from the group. By the end of August, only 3 of the original 12 hunters remained, and they were preparing to leave as well. Before they departed, Isaiah did something he had never done before. He left them a message, words carved into the bark of a tree near their final camp where they could not miss it. The message read, "This forest protects the ones you hunt. Leave and live. Return and learn what happened to those who came before you." It was signed simply with an X, the mark of an illiterate man, but the message itself was clear and eloquent. The hunters read it, looked at each other, and made the decision to leave that very day. The departure of the professional slave catchers marked a turning point for Isaiah. He had proven once again that Blackwood Forest belonged to him in a way that no one else could claim. But the victory felt hollow. He had spent 2 months living in constant tension, unable to help runaways because the forest was too hot with hunters, unable to rest because he was always planning the next move in his campaign. He realized that Delilah had been right in a way he had not wanted to admit. His sanctuary was becoming a battleground, and he was spending more energy defending it than using it for its intended purpose. In the fall of 1850, Isaiah made a decision that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. He would not abandon Blackwood Forest entirely, but he would expand his operations beyond it. He would spend part of each year traveling, working more actively with the Underground Railroad network, sharing his skills with other conductors and guides. The forest would remain his home and his ultimate sanctuary, but it would no longer be his prison, the only place where he felt safe enough to exist. The decision came with risks. Every time he left the forest, he was exposing himself to capture. Every person he revealed himself to was someone who could potentially betray him. But Isaiah had spent 9 years prioritizing safety over everything else, and he was beginning to understand that perfect safety was just another form of slavery, a cage he had built for himself out of fear. His first extended journey beyond Blackwood Forest came in the winter of 1851. He traveled north into Kentucky, making contact with Underground Railroad conductors he had only known through intermediaries. He taught them techniques for moving through hostile territory, shared his knowledge of how to read terrain and use it for concealment, showed them how to prepare caches and create backup plans. The conductors he worked with were amazed by his skills, and word of his teaching began to spread through the network. During this journey, Isaiah met a conductor named William Still, a free black man who was coordinating Underground Railroad activities across multiple states. Still was documenting the stories of escaped slaves, keeping careful records that he hoped would someday serve as testimony to the cruelty of slavery and the courage of those who fought against it. He asked Isaiah to tell him the full story of his escape and the years that followed. Isaiah, who had never spoken about these events in detail to anyone, found himself opening up to Still's patient questioning. The conversation lasted for hours, with Isaiah describing not just the dramatic confrontation with the night riders, but the long years of preparation that had made it possible, the loneliness of his exile, the satisfaction of helping others, and the doubts that sometimes kept him awake in the darkness of his cave. Still listened with deep attention, occasionally asking questions that helped Isaiah see his own story more clearly. When they were finished, Still told Isaiah something that struck him deeply. He said that Isaiah's story was important not because it was unique, but because it showed what was possible when enslaved people refused to accept their bondage, when they used intelligence and patience and courage to claim their freedom. The meeting with Still changed something in Isaiah. For years he had thought of himself as alone, as someone whose experience was so specific to Blackwood Forest that it could not be shared or replicated. But Still helped him see that the principles he had discovered, careful observation, thorough preparation, using knowledge as a weapon, could be applied in many different contexts. Isaiah realized that his story could inspire and instruct others, that he had something valuable to offer beyond just guiding people through his particular forest. When Isaiah returned to Blackwood Forest in the spring of 1851, he came back with a new sense of purpose. He would continue to maintain his sanctuary, but he would also document his knowledge more systematically, creating not just maps but detailed instructions that could help others become effective conductors on the Underground Railroad. He would make regular trips beyond the forest to train others, sharing what he had learned through hard experience. He would stop thinking of himself as a fugitive hiding in the woods and start thinking of himself as a teacher, a strategist, someone with valuable expertise to contribute to the larger fight against slavery. The years from 1851 to 1854 became the most productive period of Isaiah's life. He established a routine where he would spend the spring and summer in Blackwood Forest, helping runaways pass through and maintaining his network of caches and safe routes. Then in the fall and winter, when travel through the mountains was more difficult and fewer runaways attempted the journey, he would venture out to work with other conductors, sharing his methods and learning from their experiences. During these years, Isaiah trained more than 30 conductors in wilderness survival and evasion techniques. He helped establish several new routes through difficult terrain that had previously been considered impassable. He created a series of guide documents written in his self-taught hand that explained how to read weather patterns, how to move groups at night, how to cache supplies, and how to deal with various dangers from slave catchers to wild animals. These documents were copied and distributed through the Underground Railroad network, helping countless people Isaiah would never meet. But the work came with a cost. Isaiah was now known to many more people, and while the Underground Railroad network was generally secure, there was always the risk of betrayal or capture. Several times, Isaiah had close calls where slave catchers seemed to have information about his movements or his appearance. He developed an elaborate system of disguises and false identities, sometimes passing as a free black man with forged papers, sometimes disguising himself so thoroughly that even people who knew him did not recognize him. In the summer of 1853, Isaiah experienced his closest brush with capture since the Night Riders. He was guiding a group of 7 runaways through Blackwood Forest when they were ambushed by a patrol of slave catchers who seemed to have specific information about their route and timing. Someone, Isaiah realized, had betrayed them. The patrol had positioned themselves perfectly, blocking the main trail and forcing Isaiah's group into terrain where they could be easily surrounded. But if the slave catchers thought they had Isaiah trapped, they had underestimated how thoroughly he knew his forest. He led his group directly toward what appeared to be an impassable rock face, the slave catchers following confidently behind them. At the last moment, Isaiah guided his people into a narrow crevice in the rock that was invisible until you were standing directly in front of it. The passage led through the cliff to a network of caves on the other side, a route Isaiah had discovered years earlier but had never used before because of how dangerous and claustrophobic it was. The slave catchers, unable to follow through the narrow passage, tried to go around the cliff. By the time they reached the other side, Isaiah and his group had disappeared completely. The catchers spent 3 days searching the area, growing increasingly frustrated, and eventually giving up. But the incident shook Isaiah. Someone in the Underground Railroad network had given up information, either through torture, bribery, or betrayal. He would need to be even more careful about who he trusted and what information he shared. Despite the dangers, Isaiah continued his work. By 1854, he was one of the most respected figures in the Underground Railroad network, known for his skills and his success rate. Conductors would send their most difficult cases to him, groups that were too large or too vulnerable to move through regular channels. Isaiah took pride in never having lost a person he was guiding, a record that was almost unheard of in the dangerous work of the Underground Railroad. In the fall of 1854, 13 years after his original escape, Isaiah received word that changed everything. Marcus Rutherford, the man who had owned him, was dead. He had died in Memphis, alone and bitter, his tobacco fortune lost to bad investments and his reputation destroyed by the scandal of Isaiah's escape and his own subsequent failures. The news reached Isaiah through a conductor who thought he would want to know. Isaiah's reaction surprised him. He felt not triumph or satisfaction, but a strange sadness. Rutherford had been his enemy, the man who had bought him and would have worked him to death in the tobacco fields. But Rutherford had also been a human being, and his death closed a chapter of Isaiah's life in a way that felt oddly melancholy. With Rutherford dead, Isaiah realized that the legal reward for his capture was probably no longer active. He was still a fugitive slave according to the law, but he was no longer anyone's specific property being actively sought. The thought was liberating in a way he had not expected. For 13 years he had been defined in large part by being Marcus Rutherford's escaped slave. Now he was just Isaiah Bennett, a man living free in the mountains, helping others find their own freedom. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 and the increasing tensions between North and South over slavery's expansion gave Isaiah's work new urgency. He could feel that something large was building, that the uneasy compromise that had kept the nation together was beginning to break down. Conductors he worked with talked about the possibility of war, about what would happen to the millions still enslaved if the conflict between free and slave states finally erupted into violence. Isaiah found himself thinking about what role he might play if war came. He was now in his early 30s, still strong and healthy from his years of outdoor living, with skills that could be valuable in a military context. But he also knew that his work on the Underground Railroad was important and would remain necessary regardless of what political developments occurred. He decided to continue what he was doing, helping people escape one group at a time until circumstances forced a change in strategy. In 1855, Isaiah made his most ambitious journey yet, traveling all the way to Canada to see for himself the communities of formerly enslaved people who had made it to freedom. The journey took him 6 weeks, and what he saw both inspired and troubled him. The refugees he met were free in the legal sense, but many were struggling to make lives in a cold, unfamiliar country where they faced discrimination and economic hardship. They were grateful to be free, but freedom alone had not solved all their problems. Among the people Isaiah met in Canada was Delilah, the woman who had challenged him years earlier about whether he was truly free in his forest sanctuary. She had made it to Canada with her entire group, and she had since helped dozens of others make the same journey. Seeing Isaiah again brought tears to her eyes. She told him that his maps and his methods had saved countless lives, that conductors throughout the network spoke of him with reverence and gratitude. She also told him that she had never forgotten their conversation about freedom and safety, and she wanted to know if he had found an answer to the question of whether he was hiding or choosing. Isaiah told her honestly that he still did not have a complete answer. He had expanded his life beyond Blackwood Forest, had taken risks and helped people and made a difference in the world. But he always returned to his sanctuary in the mountains, always kept that place as his ultimate retreat. He thought perhaps that balance between engagement and sanctuary, between risk and safety, was the best answer he could find. Delilah accepted this with a nod, saying that perhaps there were many ways to be free and each person had to find their own path. The journey back to Tennessee took Isaiah through several states, and he took the opportunity to visit underground railroad stations and meet conductors he had only corresponded with through messages. He saw how his influence had spread, how techniques he had developed were now being used hundreds of miles from Blackwood Forest. He also saw the increasing danger that conductors faced, as slave states became more aggressive in their efforts to stop the Underground Railroad and federal laws made helping escaped slaves more risky even in free states. By the time Isaiah returned to Blackwood Forest in the late summer of 1855, he had been gone for almost 4 months, the longest absence since his original escape. The forest welcomed him back as it always did, and he spent several weeks repairing his camps and restocking his supply caches. But he found that the forest felt different now, or perhaps he was different. It was still his home, still the place where he felt most himself, but it was no longer the entire world to him as it had once been. That fall, Isaiah helped guide one of the largest groups he had ever attempted. 32 people, including 15 children. The group had been assembled from multiple plantations in northern Alabama and had been traveling for weeks by the time they reached Blackwood Forest. Isaiah spent 10 days moving them through the mountains, breaking them into smaller groups that could move more quickly, using different routes to avoid detection, coordinating with conductors on the other side to ensure they would have safe passage continuing north. The operation was exhausting and dangerous, and there were several close calls with slave catcher patrols. But in the end, all 32 people made it through safely, continuing their journey toward freedom. When the last group departed, the conductor who took them from Isaiah told him something that stayed with him. She said that in doing this work, in helping people escape slavery one by one or in small groups, they were doing more than just saving individual lives. They were making a statement about the fundamental injustice of slavery, proving that the system could be resisted, giving hope to those still enslaved that freedom was possible. Isaiah thought about those words often in the months that followed. He had started his journey thinking only about his own freedom, about escaping the immediate horror of his enslavement. But over 14 years, his mission had expanded to include helping others, teaching conductors, documenting methods, contributing to a larger movement. He had become part of something bigger than himself, and while that brought its own dangers and responsibilities, it also gave his life a meaning that simple survival could never provide. As 1855 turned into 1856, Isaiah began to sense that major changes were coming, not just for him personally, but for the entire nation. The violence in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, the growing polarization between North and South, the increasing boldness of abolitionists and the corresponding desperation of slave owners, all of it pointed toward a crisis that could not be avoided much longer. Isaiah prepared himself for whatever was coming, reinforcing his forest sanctuaries, training more conductors, helping as many people escape as he could while there was still time. In the spring of 1856, now 15 years after his escape from the Rutherford plantation, Isaiah met a young conductor named Harriet, who was already becoming famous in Underground Railroad circles for her daring rescues and her apparent invincibility in the face of danger. They spent several weeks working together, and Isaiah was impressed by her courage and her strategic thinking. In some ways, she reminded him of himself, someone who refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose, who used intelligence and preparation to overcome superior force. Harriet asked Isaiah why he had never come north permanently, why he continued to maintain his base in Tennessee when he could live more openly in Canada or even in northern states where free black people had some legal protections. Isaiah struggled to explain it in words. He told her that Blackwood Forest was not just where he lived but part of who he was, that he had claimed it as his own in a way that went beyond legal ownership. He said that as long as slavery existed in Tennessee, as long as people were escaping through these mountains, he needed to be here to help them. His freedom was not complete unless it included the ability to stand his ground, to defend what he had built, to refuse to be driven away by fear. Harriet understood better than most could. She told him that she felt the same pull southward, the need to keep returning to slave territory to bring others out, even though it meant risking her own freedom every time. They talked about the different forms that resistance could take, about how some people fought slavery with words and politics, while others like them fought it by making slavery less profitable and less secure, by spiriting away the human beings that the system depended on. Before Harriet left to continue her work, she gave Isaiah a gift that moved him deeply. It was a photograph of Frederick Douglass, one of the great voices of the abolitionist movement, with a quotation from one of his speeches written on the back. The quotation read, "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. Power concedes nothing without a demand." Isaiah kept the photograph in his main cave, looking at it often, drawing strength from the reminder that he was part of a larger struggle, that his work mattered in ways that extended far beyond Blackwood Forest. The summer of 1856 brought another professional slave-catching operation to the region, this one even better funded and more organized than the effort in 1850. But Isaiah was ready for them in ways they could never have anticipated. He had spent 15 years perfecting his defenses of Blackwood Forest, and he had learned from every previous confrontation. The new slave catchers found themselves facing not just one man but an entire network of conductors who had been trained by Isaiah and who used the forest as their base of operations. The slave catchers tried for 2 months to establish control of Blackwood Forest and failed completely. They found that every trail led to dead ends or dangerous terrain, that their camps were constantly infiltrated and their supplies stolen, that runaways continued to pass through the forest despite their presence. Finally, frustrated and having lost money on the operation, they gave up and left the region. Their failure became another story that added to Isaiah's legend, another piece of evidence that Blackwood Forest belonged to the man who had claimed it 15 years earlier and would not be dislodged. As 1857 began, Isaiah was approaching the 16th anniversary of his escape. He was now 34 years old, still strong and capable, but beginning to feel the accumulation of hard years. His hands bore scars from countless cuts and scrapes. His knees ached on cold mornings from years of climbing rough terrain, and he had several teeth that had been broken or lost to poor nutrition and the occasional accident. But his mind was sharper than ever, enriched by years of learning and experience, and his commitment to his mission had only grown stronger with time. That winter, Isaiah made a decision that surprised even those who knew him best. He agreed to attend an abolitionist convention in Cincinnati, traveling there under a false identity to speak to the assembled activists about his experiences and methods. It was an enormous risk. The convention would be watched by slave catchers and pro-slavery spies, and Isaiah's presence there could potentially lead to his capture. But he felt that the time had come to speak more openly, to share his story not just with individual conductors but with the broader movement that was fighting to end slavery. At the convention, Isaiah spoke to an audience of 300 people, telling them about his escape, his creation of a sanctuary in Blackwood Forest, his work helping others find freedom, and his belief that enslaved people were not helpless victims waiting to be saved but active agents in their own liberation. His speech was not polished or eloquent in the formal sense. He had never had the education that would have taught him the conventions of public speaking. But it was powerful precisely because of its raw honesty and the authority of lived experience. The audience listened in absolute silence as Isaiah described the night the riders came hunting him, how he had led them into his forest trap, how they had emerged broken and defeated. He told them about the hundreds of people he had helped over the years, about the conductors he had trained, about the methods he had developed through trial and error and bitter experience. He spoke about the cost of freedom, about what it meant to live in constant vigilance, about the loneliness and the fear and the stubborn determination to never submit to slavery again regardless of the consequences. When he finished speaking, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. People crowded around him afterward, wanting to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him how his story had inspired them. Frederick Douglass himself, who was the keynote speaker at the convention, sought Isaiah out for a private conversation. The two men talked for hours about resistance and strategy, about the different roles that people could play in the fight against slavery, about the coming crisis that they both sensed was approaching. Douglass told Isaiah something that he never forgot. He said that there were many types of heroism in the struggle against slavery. There were the orators and writers who changed minds through words. There were the politicians who fought for change within the system. There were the conductors who risked their lives repeatedly to help others escape. And then there were people like Isaiah, who had claimed a piece of ground and held it against all odds, who had transformed their own liberation into a tool for liberating others, who proved through their existence that enslaved people were not inferior beings but capable of extraordinary intelligence and courage when given the opportunity. The trip to Cincinnati reinvigorated Isaiah in ways he had not expected. He returned to Blackwood Forest with renewed energy and a deeper sense of connection to the larger abolitionist movement. He had seen that his work was not happening in isolation but was part of a vast network of resistance that stretched across the nation. He had met people who were fighting slavery in their own ways, using their own gifts, and he had come to appreciate that every form of resistance was valuable, that the movement needed the quiet work of conductors and the public work of speakers, and the violent resistance of those who chose to fight back with weapons. But the trip had also reminded him how dangerous his position was. Several people at the convention had recognized him from descriptions or from stories they had heard, and while no one betrayed him, it meant that his anonymity was eroding. The more famous he became as a symbol and a legend, the more risky it was for him to operate in the real world. Isaiah began to think more carefully about his long-term future, about what would happen when he could no longer move through the world without being recognized and captured. The spring of 1857 brought news that shook the abolitionist community. The Supreme Court had ruled in the Dred Scott case that black people, whether enslaved or free, had no rights that white people were bound to respect. The ruling meant that even free black people in northern states were not safe from being claimed as someone's property. It meant that the work of the Underground Railroad was even more dangerous than before, as there was now essentially no legal protection for anyone helping escaped slaves. For Isaiah, the Dred Scott decision confirmed what he had always known on a gut level. The law was not on his side, would never be on his side, and his freedom depended entirely on his ability to defend it himself. The ruling actually strengthened his resolve rather than discouraging him. If the highest court in the land had declared that he had no rights, then he would continue to claim his rights anyway, through action rather than through any appeal to legal authority. That summer, Isaiah pushed himself harder than ever, helping record numbers of runaways pass through Blackwood Forest. He was driven by a sense of urgency, a feeling that time was running out, that whatever was coming would change everything. He barely slept, constantly moving through the forest, guiding groups, training new conductors, maintaining his network of caches and safe routes. Those who worked with him during this period worried about him, seeing how he was driving himself to exhaustion, but Isaiah would not slow down. In the fall of 1857, Isaiah experienced something he had not felt in years, genuine fear about his own safety. He received word through the Underground Railroad network that a massive reward had been posted for information leading to his capture. The reward was not from one plantation owner, but from an association of slave owners across multiple states who had pooled their resources. The sum was staggering, $2,000, more money than most people would see in a lifetime. With that kind of reward, the risk of betrayal increased dramatically. Isaiah responded by pulling back from his more public activities. He stopped attending abolitionist conventions and limited his contacts with the wider Underground Railroad network. He returned to Blackwood Forest and focused on the core work of helping runaways pass through, working only with conductors he knew personally and trusted completely. It was a retreat of sorts, a recognition that his effectiveness depended on staying free and that his growing fame was threatening that freedom. But even in retreat, Isaiah continued to innovate and improve his operations. He developed a new system of dead drops for communication, places where messages and supplies could be left without requiring face-to-face meetings. He created backup identities and escape routes in case his main sanctuary was ever compromised. He trained a small group of trusted conductors to be able to continue his work if he was captured or killed, ensuring that Blackwood Forest would remain a safe passage even without him. As 1858 began, 17 years after his escape, Isaiah found himself reflecting on how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. He was older now, marked by years of hard living, but he was also more skilled, more connected, more effective at his mission than he had ever been. Blackwood Forest was no longer just his personal sanctuary, but a symbol of resistance known throughout the Underground Railroad network. The techniques he had developed were being used by conductors across multiple states. The maps he had created were saving lives in places he would never visit. Yet in some fundamental ways, nothing had changed. He was still legally enslaved, still subject to capture and punishment if he was ever caught, still living in a society that denied his humanity and his rights. The struggle was not over and would not be over until slavery itself was abolished. Isaiah had made peace with the likelihood that this would not happen in his lifetime, that he would die still fighting, still running, still free, but never entirely safe. In the spring of 1858, Isaiah had an encounter that reminded him why he continued the work despite the risks and the exhaustion. He was helping a young man named Joshua escape from a plantation near Chattanooga. Joshua was only 16, the same age Isaiah had been when he was sold to Marcus Rutherford. As they traveled through Blackwood Forest, Joshua asked Isaiah how he had survived 17 years as a fugitive, how he kept going when the fear and loneliness must have been overwhelming. Isaiah thought about the question carefully before answering. He told Joshua that he kept going by focusing not on the fear of what might happen, but on the reality of what he had already accomplished. Every day he woke up free was a day he had won. Every person he helped escape was a victory against the system that had tried to break him. Every time a slave catcher entered Blackwood Forest and left empty-handed was proof that he was stronger than they were. He kept going, he told Joshua, because stopping would mean admitting that his enemies were right, that he was property rather than a person, and that was something he would never do. Joshua listened to these words with an intensity that reminded Isaiah of his younger self, hungry for any wisdom that might help him survive in a hostile world. Before they parted ways, Joshua asked Isaiah if he thought slavery would ever end, if there would ever be a time when black people could live without fear of being captured and enslaved. Isaiah told him honestly that he did not know, that he hoped so but could not be certain, but that regardless of whether they lived to see that day, they had a responsibility to fight as if victory was possible, because surrendering to despair was just another form of slavery. The summer of 1858 brought the most severe test yet of Isaiah's defenses. A coordinated operation involving over 30 slave catchers established a blockade around Blackwood Forest, attempting to prevent anyone from entering or leaving. They were not trying to capture Isaiah directly, but to cut off his ability to help runaways, to turn Blackwood Forest from a sanctuary into a trap. For the first time in 17 years, Isaiah found himself genuinely concerned that his forest fortress might be breached. The blockade lasted for 6 weeks, and during that time, Isaiah had to completely adapt his operations. He could not guide groups through the normal routes because the forest was surrounded. Instead, he began using a series of caves and underground passages that connected different parts of the forest to the outside world. Routes that were so difficult and dangerous that he had avoided them except as a last resort. The passages required crawling through tight spaces, wading through underground rivers, and navigating in complete darkness. But they worked. Groups continued to pass through Blackwood Forest despite the blockade, seemingly appearing and disappearing like ghosts. The slave catchers, frustrated by their inability to stop the flow of runaways, began to suspect that there must be underground passages they were not aware of. They started exploring caves and sinkholes around the forest perimeter, trying to find these hidden routes. Isaiah watched their efforts with grim amusement. They were looking in the right places but did not understand the full complexity of the cave system. Without his years of exploration and mapping, they would never find the passages that actually connected to his network. Eventually, the blockade failed for the same reason most attempts to catch Isaiah failed. Economics. Keeping 30 men in the field for 6 weeks cost enormous amounts of money, and when the results did not justify the expense, the funding dried up. The slave catchers withdrew, and Blackwood Forest returned to its normal status as a place that slave owners feared and avoided. Isaiah had won again, but the victory felt more exhausting than triumphant. He was tired, bone-deep tired, in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. As 1859 began, Isaiah started to think seriously about what would come after him, about the legacy he would leave when he was gone. He was not yet 40 years old, but he had lived a hard life, and he knew that his time could end at any moment, through capture, accident, or simple violence. He began to write more extensively, documenting not just his methods but his philosophy, trying to articulate why he had chosen the path he had walked and what he believed it meant. These writings, composed in his self-taught hand on whatever paper or hide he could find, became something like a memoir and a manual combined. Isaiah wrote about the importance of preparation, of knowing your terrain better than your enemies could, of turning apparent weakness into strength. He wrote about the psychological aspects of resistance, about how maintaining your humanity and dignity was itself a form of victory. He wrote about the loneliness of freedom and the cost of safety, about choices that had no easy answers, about living with fear and uncertainty and still choosing to fight. Isaiah left instructions that these writings should be distributed through the Underground Railroad network if he was killed or captured. He wanted future generations to know not just that he had existed, but why he had made the choices he made, what principles had guided him, what he believed about freedom and resistance and human dignity. He knew that slavery would eventually end, whether through war or political change or simple economic collapse. And when it did, he wanted there to be a record of how some enslaved people had fought back, had refused to accept their degradation, had claimed their freedom through intelligence and courage and stubborn determination. The writings took him months to complete, and when he was finished, Isaiah felt a sense of completion that surprised him. He had not realized how important it was to him to articulate his life's work in words, to transform his actions into ideas that could be shared and debated and learned from. The writings gave him a sense of immortality that went beyond mere survival. Even if he died tomorrow, even if he was captured and executed, these words would remain, would tell his story, would continue to inspire and instruct. In the fall of 1859, just over 18 years after his original escape, Isaiah heard news that electrified the entire abolitionist community. A man named John Brown had led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, attempting to start a slave uprising. The raid had failed. Brown had been captured and executed, but the event sent shockwaves through both North and South. Isaiah found himself thinking deeply about Brown's action, about the choice to use violence rather than the quiet resistance that had defined Isaiah's own path. He concluded that there was room in the struggle for many different approaches, that Brown's willingness to die for the cause was noble even if the tactics were flawed, that the important thing was refusing to accept slavery rather than the specific method chosen to resist it. But Isaiah also felt that his own approach, helping people escape one by one, teaching skills that would outlast him, claiming and holding ground, was equally valid and perhaps more sustainable in the long run. Not everyone needed to be a martyr. Some people served the cause best by surviving, by being proof that freedom was possible and worth fighting for. As 1860 began and the nation moved closer to the crisis that everyone could feel approaching, Isaiah prepared himself for whatever came next. He was 40 years old now, entering what would have been middle age if he had lived an ordinary life. But there was nothing ordinary about the life he had chosen. He had transformed himself from property into legend, from fugitive into teacher, from victim into victor. Blackwood Forest, which had been his hiding place, had become his kingdom. The fear that had driven him to run had been transformed into the courage to stand his ground. The story of Isaiah Bennett would continue for several more years, through the Civil War and beyond. But the essential arc had been established in those first 18 years after his escape. He had proven what was possible when enslaved people refused to accept their bondage, when they used their minds as weapons, when they turned apparent weakness into strength. He had shown that one person with knowledge and determination could defeat armies of slave catchers. That freedom was not something granted by others but claimed by those brave enough to seize it. And he had demonstrated something else, something perhaps even more important than his tactical victories. He had shown that freedom was not just about escaping physical bondage but about maintaining human dignity, about helping others, about creating meaning and purpose in life beyond mere survival. Isaiah Bennett had not just run from slavery. He had built an alternative to it, a life of his own design lived on his own terms, and in doing so he had become more free than many people who had never been enslaved. That ultimately was his true victory, not the dramatic defeat of the night riders, but the quiet, persistent, daily choice to live as a fully realized human being in a society that denied his humanity. That was the lesson of his life, and it remained relevant long after the specific circumstances of his time had passed into history.